Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well, and welcome to our last week of classes for the semester. We have a lecture tonight, we have a lecture later this week, and then next week will be finals week. More information on that later in the week. Tonight, I'm going to go ahead and dive into a talk about how we get our energy, where we get our energy, and about fossil fuels, and I want to kind of move away from what we've been talking about for the past three lectures. As you know, we've been talking about greenhouse gas emissions and how, when you look at all of the various ways that various factors weigh in on Earth's climate, there's only one factor that matches the pattern that we've talked about so far here. And it is the emission by human activities of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion. All of the other things that we've talked about, whether they are land based or earth based phenomena or phenomena that are based on the Earth's relationship to other objects in the solar system, including our sun, none of those fit with the pattern that's seen here of this substantial warming and an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations over the past few decades. And as we discussed, this is largely the best hypothesis we have to explain this is that this is a consequence of human activities from greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion, and that includes coal and petroleum and natural gas. And of these, I want to talk about petroleum tonight. But what I want to do is specifically focus on petroleum itself. I want to try and get away from the harmful impacts because we've already talked about those at length. I don't think, to keep talking about the implications for global climate change based on an increase in greenhouse gases. What I want to do instead is look at petroleum itself and look at how we're using it and how much of it we're using it and how much of it remains. And so with that in mind, let's talk about petroleum. We depend on it. As I have emphasized repeatedly, we absolutely depend on it. Not just here in Southern California, but around the world. That said, particularly in Southern California, if you've gone driving anywhere here in our area or even in the United States, you've probably encountered massive amounts of car traffic, and the vast majority of those cars are not electric. They are gas powered, which means they're based on oil, they're based on petroleum. And so, for us to get around, probably for you to go to your job, or for those of you who come to campus, for those of you who get to school, for those of you who go shopping, in many cases, you're probably using fossil fuels. Now, it's possible some of you only do biking or drive electrical vehicles and so forth. Nevertheless, the vast majority of people in California depend on petroleum, depend on oil for transportation. As we've discussed, we also depend on it for air travel, not just for us traveling from one place to another, but also a lot of the shipping that goes on today is conducted via air. And you know this if you live in Southern California. It happens all over the place, but we've got a bunch of major airports here. We've got LAX in Ontario and John Wayne, and we even have an airport in San Bernardino, all of which deal with commercial traffic in addition to passenger traffic. And for those of you who live in our Southern California area, if the air travel isn't enough for you, we also have rail travel. And you've probably seen any number of freight trains carrying freight all over our area, up and down the mountains, throughout the valleys. And all of those trains are running off petroleum. They're running off oil and oil byproducts. And so it's essential for that transportation as well. If you live closer to the coast, particularly down near Long Beach, you're probably familiar with the shipping that comes into and out of those ports that is also being driven by petroleum and petroleum byproducts. And so clearly, just about every aspect of your life, just about every aspect of my life depends on petroleum. And all of this is being protected by the United States military, which in turn, on the one hand, depends on petroleum in order to operate. And number two, a big part of their budget is protecting American assets, United States assets in oil rich countries. And that's even going on today, though I don't want to get sidetracked on that discussion. I simply want to emphasize as strongly as I can that we are absolutely and entirely dependent on petroleum, on oil, on fossil fuels, but particularly petroleum. And the majority of that use is transportation. We do use it for some other things. There's residential use, quite a bit of industrial use, but the vast majority of it is transporting, whether it's people or items, it's transporting things from one area to another. And that's important to keep in mind. We even use it, as I mentioned, to get to space. When we launch rockets into space, whether it's low Earth orbit or potentially eventually getting to the moon, maybe even Mars, we're going to depend on the energy that is released from fossil fuels in order to make that happen. And we don't have any other options. We can't use solar power or wind power for that. It's essential that we have those petroleum products available to have the bang for the buck, to release all of that pent up energy that was stored over millions of years in oil, in petroleum, to turn that energy loose and use it to reach orbit, to reach out for other planets. And as we mentioned, we also use oil for other things besides energy generation. We use it for plastics, we use it for lubrication, we use it for paving our roads. But again, the vast majority of it is going to be, almost half of it is going to be for gasoline. And then if you look higher up on this list, you also have other kinds of transportation fuel, like aviation fuel and heavy ship oil. All of those are necessary as well in order to get from one place to another. So yes, we do use petroleum for a variety of different things, but the big use is going to be as gasoline. Now, we've mentioned the Conference of the Parties. We talked about that briefly, and I wanted to mention that in the past couple of years, I haven't updated this for this year because there are still things being written about this year, so I want to make sure my data are up to date before I bring that in. But a couple of years ago, it was clear that even though fossil fuels are a concern, the people who were organizing the meeting and running the meeting did not want to have a discussion about the phase out of fossil fuels, and even argued in this case back in 2023 that there was no science behind the demands for the phase out of fossil fuels. In other words, at the highest levels of the United Nations in their annual meetings to discuss climate change, they are not currently considering phasing out fossil fuels as an approach that is needed in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving the current climate change. This is also true. This is also from that same meeting where they say that we've focused on renewable energy for too long and it's time to get back to fossil fuels. In the more recent, from last year, again, this is not this year's meeting, this is from last year, as we talked about briefly, Saudi Arabia, again, as an oil exporting country, was very clear that they were not going to be willing to tolerate any discussion of phasing out fossil fuels or transitioning away from fossil fuels in any text that was produced as a consequence of that. So even as we move forward with petroleum, the focus from at least some petroleum exporting countries is that that petroleum focus needs to continue, and that any discussion to the contrary is not going to be encouraged at these conferences of the parties. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, with that in mind, let's look at the resource that we're talking about. We're talking about global petroleum. And as we discussed in an earlier lecture, there are about 1.72 trillion barrels of oil in recoverable, proven reserves. I'm going to talk about those terms in a minute, so please be aware of exactly what I'm saying. 1.72 trillion barrels of recoverable oil in proven reserves. This is important. Now, that's how much we have. How fast are we using it? Globally, 97 million barrels, 97 million with an M barrels are consumed every day. Which, if you do math as quickly as I do, and this took me a while, that means that 35 billion barrels are consumed every year. globally. And so if you divide 1.72 trillion by 35 billion, that gives you, at current rates of consumption, there are about 49 years of oil left on Earth. That's in recoverable oil in proven reserves. And again, I'm going to come back to that discussion. But this gives you an idea that there is a time constraint. There is a volume constraint on the amount of petroleum, the amount of oil that we have available for our use. And at our current rates of usage, it's limited. Now, I am an older individual. Chances are good I'm not going to be here in 49 years, but the chances are fairly good that a lot of you will be. And so this is something that you might see in your lifetime. I'm going to jump ahead and say right off the bat, you're not going to run out of oil in your lifetime. So don't worry about it. Don't get all tense. You're not going to run out of oil in your lifetime. Deep breath. That said, that doesn't mean everything's going to be clear sailing and we can continue to depend upon petroleum, upon oil as a readily available and affordable, key point, resource. Remember our economic model where you use matter, you apply energy, and you yield a product, and there is some waste generated. What we are looking at now is that the matter that we have been using, the raw petroleum that is being used to power our civilizations across the world, all of them, not just our personal civilization here in the US, but pretty much all of them, the amount of matter is diminishing. And so as that diminishes, you have a variety of things you can do. You can increase the amount of energy that you need to extract the resource. That means there's more cost up front to obtain the resource. Or you can reduce the amount of the resource that you are producing. Or you can produce the same amount of the resource, but you can take those extra costs from the energy and charge more to the consumer. Or to keep prices down, you can increase the amount of waste. You can cut corners. You can find ways to save money here and there. I can give you one example off the top of my head from the petroleum industry where, God, it's about a decade ago. In order to save money, what was happening was they had personnel who were monitoring different rigs. And it turns out if you have a little instrument that you install on each rig, you can do it remotely, which means you save money on all those jobs, all of those salaries, all of those health benefits, because now you've got a little device that's doing it automatically, electronically. We talk about automation replacing people. This is just one example, but those devices were cheaper than people. And so as things became more economically fraught, it was a way to cut costs and turn corners. And the fact that it impacted any number of families and impacted any number of jobs, that would be the waste. That would be the externalized cost in this transaction. You can also do all of the above. You can increase the amount of energy you're using to obtain the matter. You can also reduce the amount you're producing. You can also increase the cost that you're charging, and you can continue to find ways to cut corners and save money. All of these are options as the resource continues to diminish if it is a finite resource, if it is a non-renewable resource. What you're looking for is the difference between supply and demand. When the supply goes up, when you have plenty of something, the demand goes down, and so the price goes down. When the supply goes down, the demand goes up, and so the price goes up. The less you have of something, the more you can charge for it. And so, generally speaking, corporations are looking for that sweet spot between the price and the quantity. So they're charging what people will pay, not too much, not too little. They're not hurting their profit margin, but they are also not driving themselves out of business by charging too high a price. They're looking for that nice sweet spot between supply and demand. With that said, through time, over long periods of time, it is projected that oil, petroleum is going to diminish. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be very straightforward, and it hasn't been very straightforward. In fact, this is a chart, and it's updated as of today, except that it says May 2025. I apologize for that. It should say November, or excuse me, December 25, because I did that today. Forgive me. I'm going to try pausing this. I apologize. I hope you didn't notice that pause. I hope it wasn't too dramatic, and I hope we're recording again and I didn't screw this up. But yeah, this is January 2000 to today, December 2025. And what you're looking at is how the price per barrel of petroleum globally has changed from 2000 on. And so, what I want you to look at, for example, is how it is spiked from 2000 up to about 2008. And what happened is that right here in about 2005, shale oil became profitable. And shale oil is oil that's trapped in rocks that have already been pumped for conventional petroleum, conventional oil. But once the price reached over $100 a barrel, suddenly it was economically viable to start trying to use more expensive techniques to pump oil out of the ground from those rocks. And that's a practice known as hydrological fracturing, also nicknamed fracking. And basically, what it means is you take materials and you pump them into those rocks that have had the conventional oil pumped out of them. And by breaking up those rocks, you free more petroleum. It's more expensive to do it that way, but if your supply is going down and your demand is going up and your price is going up, then eventually you reach a point, which they did around 2005, where oil is so expensive that it's worth the extra money to start doing fracking. And so that's when fracking really took off. So it's around 2005 when shale oil becomes profitable. And once that happened, everything went nuts. People start betting on money, the markets start investing in oil. And as a consequence, you had a boom in shale oil. And suddenly there are communities in North Dakota, in Texas, and so on that are being built around oil reserves that previously were considered to be exploited or exhausted or inaccessible. And now, with the onset of fracking, they were money makers. And so you could build entire housing communities. People could move there, they could get jobs there, and everybody's excited. And it's the wave of the future. And then the Great Recession happens. Okay. And it happens, you can see it peaking there around 2007 and then plummeting throughout 2008 and into 2009. And so that's when all of that evaporated, and suddenly the price drops to a little bit above $60 a barrel, which is no longer worth investing in fracking. It's no longer profitable. You would lose money on that. And so at that point, all of those new communities where people were moving and those new jobs, all of that evaporates. It's all gone. Those people are out of work. The newly built houses are left empty. This actually happened. And the market pretty much collapses. Eventually, we pull out of the Great Recession, things recover, and for a while there was a period of relative stability until about 2014. And then, interestingly, you had an oil glut. And this was because of Saudi Arabia. And what they determined was that they felt they were losing market share globally to United States and Canadian fracking, to the shale oil revolution. As more and more shale oil is generating petroleum, suddenly that's cutting into the market share of Saudi Arabia. And so, what Saudi Arabia did, and this is not criticizing them, this is strictly a business decision, and from their perspective, it was a good business decision, is you artificially lower your prices, and you do that by increasing supply. You artificially increase supply. You pump more than anybody wants or needs, and it artificially depresses the cost. And so it drops it down to below $50 a barrel. And at that point, once again, you've driven the fracking industry out of business because they can't afford to frack at at those prices. And so there was a period of artificial reduction. However, Saudi Arabia doing that, it's going to hurt their own bottom line as well. And so they did it for as long as they could. Eventually, they realized that it's hurting their own finances. They can't prolong it. And so they eventually restored the balance in the amount of petroleum that they were exporting, and prices sort of recover until COVID-19 hits in 2020. And for those of you who were around at the time, you probably remembered nobody was driving. The freeways were awesome if you actually were out on the road because there's nobody else out there with you. Same thing. There is a huge glut of oil because nobody is driving, so nobody's buying gasoline. So all those reserves are just sitting there, and the price absolutely bottomed out. Eventually, we pull out of the initial phase of the pandemic. I would argue that we are still in a pandemic. We just aren't paying much attention anymore, to the point where people start driving again, they start flying again, they start traveling again, up to the summer of 2022, where prices are being artificially inflated. And this is where we are today, right around $60 a barrel. Now, fracking is still marginally profitable at this point because since that early onset in 2005, petroleum companies have found ways to cut corners to make sure that things like the Great Recession, things like that oil glut back in 2014, don't catch them by surprise anymore and don't hurt their bottom lines anymore. So, where they are capable of cutting costs, they have done so. And so now, at around $65 a barrel, hydrological fracturing can be profitable. I want you to remember this pattern. I may not test you on this pattern. I may not, because it's a lot to take in. But what I want you to see is pretty much where we were in the year 2000 and where we are now hasn't changed very much. And yet it has changed from year to year over the past quarter century. There's been a lot of change, and the amount of petroleum is only one factor of that. That's what drove up the initial price that made hydrological fracturing profitable. And then outside of petroleum, economic factors weighed in, like the Great Recession, like COVID-19. Those things weighed in and caused the price to fluctuate. So, what we are talking about here is going to be the amount of petroleum on the planet, the amount that we are using, the amount that is available to us, but that doesn't mean that any loss of that or any increase in demand is going to result in a straightforward one-to-one relationship, because there are so many other global factors at play in the cost of petroleum. That said, this has been debated for well over half a century. Back in 1952, a gentleman named Marion Hubbert proposed the concept of what he called peak oil. Back in 1952, he looked at the amount of oil that was available, and then he projected up to a little before the year 2000 that that was as far as he was willing to project. And then in about the year 2000, we would peak. And by peak oil, it means we would be producing enough only to keep pace with the amount we were consuming. And if we produced more, we would be consuming more. So you would suddenly enter into a negative decline. And that's what he's talking about. As you're finding more and more new oil resources, they aren't enough to keep up with the older oil resources that we are consuming. And eventually, he argued by about the year 2200, we would be pretty much out of oil. Now, this is what he projected back in 1956. Okay? Here's what actually happened. And you can see that the blue line was pretty much his projection in terms of his oil estimate, and the red jagged line is what actually happened. And you can see right over there towards the right, exactly like we just talked about, once hydrological fracturing or fracking becomes a factor, suddenly the supply of oil becomes more abundant. It becomes more robust. And fracking wasn't something that he had foreseen as ever really being financially viable. It's not that he didn't know about it. Fracking is actually an old idea that goes back decades, but it didn't become an important idea until oil became so expensive that it was necessary in order to keep supplies up. And so that spike you see in the red line over there on the right was something that Hubbert didn't foresee, because he had no idea that oil would eventually become so expensive that it would be worthwhile to actually practice fracking. And we've seen this in short here in the United States. We've seen what happens when you reach that peak and it bottoms out. You probably, none of you are old enough to remember, but if you go back to the early 70s, that's when the United States experienced its own peak. And what suddenly happened is oil became very, very expensive. This is from, I think, 1972. And those are amazingly high prices. And look at the line of cars that are waiting to get gas. because gas was so suddenly such a rare commodity, relatively speaking, that you would wait literally hours to get it. I remember this because this is the early 1970s. I'm 9 or 10 years old. Maybe you remember being a kid when you were 9 or 10 years old and your parents would be stuck in line for hours at a time, and it seemed like an eternity. It seemed like it would never, ever end. And that's what we would have to do. We would stay in line and wait out those long, long lines. You can see this one going all the way around the block just to get into a gas station. They even had things broken up by even days and odd days. So if you had an odd numbered license plate, you went on odd days. If you had an even numbered license plate, you went on even days. And that way you had to make sure that you were going on the correct day. And if you weren't, then you're wasting your time in line. It really was that tight. Clearly, we're moving beyond that or have moved beyond that. But that's what happens when oil becomes a limited commodity. And it wasn't until imports really beefed up to cover the difference that we avoided these issues in the future. So this is what happened. Now, here's what people are saying about our future, not in terms of the United States, but globally. And this is a scenario from 2015. And you can see that what they're projecting is around the year 2020, there's going to be a peak in the amount of oil and gas liquids being produced. And here we are in the year 2025. And what you're seeing is we should be, according to this scenario from just 10 years ago, we should be in that terminal decline. We should be past the idea of peak oil. And that's not what has happened. So far, in terms of reality, you can see here you've got three different curves, a light blue one, a darker blue one, and a still darker blue one. The lower one is the light blue one. That is a peak that was estimated from 2005. The middle one is from 2010. And you can see that, so the first one is expected to peak around the year 2000, 2005. Pretty much what Hubbert was saying. The second one, 2010, that was expected to peak in 2010. And then the dark blue one was the one we just saw that was expected to peak in 2020. In other words, people keep projecting what is going to happen, and yet production continues to keep pace. We don't hit those peaks. We continue to produce beyond those peaks. That's the black line that you see there. But I also want you to notice the squiggly gray line, and that's trending in the opposite direction, and that's the growth rate. And so what you're looking at is that production is increasing and avoiding those peaks, but growth is decreasing. And this is not a sustainable pattern. Eventually, as growth continues to drop, you're going to stop missing those peaks and you're going to start seeing the decline that Hubbert talked about. And people are still debating when that peak is going to happen, when that decline is going to happen, whether it is at all. That is debated by some people as well. But you are still talking about a finite resource that is being consumed. And that is something to keep in mind. We've seen what happens with other resources in a local context. If you go back to our discussion about Monterey Bay and a renewable resource, sea otters, that was consumed so quickly that it could not replenish itself faster than the rate of consumption, and so it became non-renewable and was eliminated. And then you had abalone that went through that same course, and then you had sardines that went through that same course, and it was resource after resource after resource. After one failed, you went to another one, and after that one failed, you went to another one, and eventually you ran out of all of them. And the economy collapsed in that community. What we are talking about is a resource that is global. And again, that is over and above the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change, as we discussed. This is strictly looking at petroleum as a non renewable, finite resource in our current rates of consumption. Now, I will test you on this as well when we talk about peak oil. When I started teaching this class, the whole discussion of peak oil was peak oil supply. And this is the definition: the point in time when the maximum rate of extraction is reached, after which it is expected to enter terminal decline. That's the definition. Maximum rate of extraction. That's the rate of extraction. Again, that means after that peak, you can still extract more, but it's not keeping up with the reservoirs that are being consumed. you're still losing oil, losing petroleum overall. That's peak oil supply. More recently, the discussion has been about peak oil demand. And this is a different thing where they talk about the demand for petroleum at any price in response to technological developments as well as increasing pressure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, in this argument, peak oil demand comes when people are shifting more and more away from petroleum as an energy source and shifting into renewable energy resources such as solar and wind and so forth. And as more and more people make that shift, as more nations, more countries make that shift, then it eases up the demand for oil, and so the demand goes down. And so you have peak oil demand. These are two different concepts. They're both frequently referred to as peak oil. So if you read about peak oil online, please be aware to check to see which one they're talking about, whether it's peak oil supply or peak oil demand. And the reason this becomes an issue, at least in terms of supply, so far we have been talking about proven reserves. There are also the total estimated reserves, not proven, but still potentially, mark that word, potentially out there. And looking at numbers like this, you breathe a sigh of relief. You say, okay, well, we've taken care of the proven reserves, but there's all that other petroleum out there. We've got enough to last us centuries. We should be fine. We should be doing great. I'm glad you thought that, but I don't want you thinking that for too long because I want you to know these terms as well. Proven reserves are reserves that have a certainty, quote unquote, of at least 90% of being successfully recovered. Okay? That's a good investment. You open this new oil field or you start fracking in a previously known oil field and it's a proven reserve, so you've got a 90% or more chance of being successful. Probable reserves are reserves that have a 50% success rate or estimated confidence level of 50%, meaning you go into an area either to pump conventional oil or to frack for shale oil, and odds are pretty much even. It's a coin flip whether you're going to succeed or not. And I want you to think about that. Imagine you were an investor and you want to invest your money and you want to pay money to an oil company with an even chance that it'll break the bank. Either you'll get the oil or you won't, and it's 50-50. That's not necessarily something a lot of investors really want to invest in because that's even odds. That's very tough. I wouldn't bet even odds in Vegas. I wouldn't do that because I don't bet in Vegas. There's no point. But you know what I mean? That's not a good bet. And then there are possible reserves, and those are reserves with an only 10% estimated probability of recovery, which means that the petroleum is there, but there's almost no chance that you're actually going to get it. So when we go back to the total estimated reserves, it includes both probable reserves and possible reserves. So even though the oil may be there, the odds of getting it out of the ground are actually not very good. And as we're going to talk about in a moment, if you do get it out of the ground, it's going to be expensive. And so here is the forecast from the International Energy Agency. I think that's what IEA stands for. Production forecast for fields yet to be developed. And here we are in 2025. And you can see pretty much all of these, with the possible exception of non-OPEC onshore fields, all of these are in decline anyway. So even with estimated reserves that have yet to be developed, we're not looking at them being terribly productive. So even if you beat those 50% odds or those 10% odds, you're still talking about diminished capacity. You're talking about diminished results from those. And finally, I want to bring this in because we're looking at, again, proved, probable, possible. And then over there, I want you to see technically recoverable resources. From what I'm reading, I continue to see more and more about technically recoverable resources. But please notice the line on the bottom, the certainty of the resource, more certain and less certain. And you can see that technically recoverable, essentially it means we know how to get it out of the ground. We theoretically do. But we aren't talking about actually having the equipment. We aren't talking about actually having the money. We actually aren't talking about the personnel. We are leaving all of that aside. It is technically recoverable. As an example, it is technically possible for us to go to Mars, right? We know how to build rockets. We know where Mars is. We know that we will need spacesuits. Okay? Technically, it's possible, but we haven't done it yet because it is enormously expensive. It is enormously dangerous. And at the moment, we simply don't have the resources to go. We're still trying to get back to the moon, much less Mars. And I know we talk about Mars, and there are some people who say, oh, we'll be there next year or in the next 2 or 3 years. And they've been saying that for 15 years. So, is it true that Mars is technically reachable? It is. Does that mean it's going to be easy and affordable? It absolutely does not. So, when people talk about technically recoverable resources, keep in mind that means they're leaving costs absolutely out of the picture. They're leaving current abilities absolutely out of the picture. Technically, it's possible. That doesn't mean it's actually doable in reality. And I mention that because there are people out there, and I'm picking on a guy named Mike Rowe, who you may have heard of. He's a television host and narrator, and this is actually a Facebook post of his from a couple of years ago when he says it seems hypocritical to lecture the world on the evils of fossil fuels, blah, 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 blah. If we need oil and natural gas to provide us with enough electricity to keep us all on the grid, as we obviously do, then what possible justification can there be to purchase it elsewhere? In other words, he's wondering, and he says this, I'm wondering why America is purchasing so much oil and natural gas from foreign countries when we have all we need right here. The argument being, let's keep going with what we have, which means taking advantage of those probable resources, of those possible resources, of those technically recoverable resources, because we don't have enough in proven reserves. If you look at the United States, recoverable oil in proven reserves, we have around 44.4 billion barrels of recoverable oil. So if we import nothing, and we sell nothing, we just use our own oil, we consume 7.3 billion barrels of oil, just us, the United States, every year, which means we could go for about 6 years doing this without imports. So that's why we bring in oil, because there isn't enough. And now, if we were to do that, cancel all imports, cancel all exports, depend on our own oil, what is going to happen is our proven reserves are going to go down. Our probable reserves and our possible reserves are going to come into play, but again, they're going to become more expensive. And that means the cost of petroleum is going to go up, the cost of gas is going to go up, the cost of oil is going to go up. And eventually, we will reach a point where we will look at what we are spending and look at what's available from other nations and say, to heck with this stupid idea, let's start importing stuff again. Rather than go down that road, what we do is not only import from other nations, but export to other nations and make a profit that way. And so that's why we have the system we work. Some estimates have suggested that there may be as much as 1.66 trillion barrels of oil in technically recoverable reserves. And again, technical recovery in this sense ignores the economics and price. At some point, those costs have to be passed along to the consumer. Maybe I'm being cynical here, and if I am, you can yell at me. But what I would suggest is that current oil company CEOs are not going to take much of a cut in salary. Current oil company shareholders are not willing to see a drop in their dividend payments, which means the only way you can cover the costs of technically recoverable reserves is to pass that cost along to the consumers. And eventually, at that point, oil will price itself out of utility. It will become so expensive that everybody will be looking for some other alternative, something else to do. Which brings us to a TV show I grew up on called The Beverly Hillbillies. Probably all of you are too young to know about this show. It was a very silly show. I am not recommending that you go back and watch it. But for some of you who may have grown up with parents who grew up with it, you may remember the jingle that was the song for the show. I am not going to sing it for you. I could, but I won't because I want you to think kindly of me. But the quotes are down there. Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed, a poor mountaineer, barely kept his family fed. Then one day he was shooting at some food, and up from the ground came a bubble in crude oil, that is, black gold, Texas tea. Now, shooting the ground for food yielded oil because oil was so abundant. And as I think I even showed you some oil saturated rocks out in Kern County in an earlier lecture, it was so abundant that it was easy to obtain. It's right there. All you have to do is sink a well, start pumping, and you move to Beverly Hills. Everybody's happy. Okay? Now, what happens once you start exhausting those resources, once it's not so easy? We can document that with a concept called energy return on energy investment. And an energy return on energy investment is the ratio of the amount of energy obtained from a resource relative to the amount of energy used to obtain the resource. Okay? Now, let me give you an example. Back in the 1930s, the energy return on energy investment was around 100 to 1, meaning, let's say you use 1 barrel's worth of petroleum as energy. You burn that barrel. You could produce 100 barrels of petroleum. It took that amount of energy because petroleum was relatively easy to produce because it's just sitting there at the surface waiting for you to shoot at some food and the oil comes up and off you go to Beverly Hills. Okay? That's the 1930s. By the 1970s, it had dropped to 30 to 1. That's still not a bad investment, but look how far it's dropped. Now, for every barrel worth of energy you use, you're only getting 30 barrels of petroleum, of product. So clearly it is still profitable, but not nearly so much because the really, really, really easy oil has already been obtained, processed, and burned. By the 2000s, it's down to 11 to 1. And so increasingly not profitable. That doesn't mean oil companies aren't raking in billions of dollars. They are. But it does mean that obviously the price of oil has gone up, generally speaking. And again, I showed you that graph earlier that shows we haven't changed so much from the year 2000. And that is absolutely true. But probably if you've been driving the past few years, you know that there's been some wild fluctuations in price across that time. Okay, those fluctuations are going to continue, but it is likely because of things like this that you will continue to see an increase in the cost of oil. There's a reason you haven't, but I'm going to touch on that in a moment. This is as of the 2000s. By the year 2019, it was 6 to 1. And so you can plot this on a graph as well. And what eventually happens is by the time you get to 3 to 1 or 2 to 1, suddenly there's almost no point in producing petroleum because you're not making enough of a profit. How do you solve this? How do you solve this? You reduce the demand so that the supply goes up. You find easier, less expensive ways of producing the petroleum, which is difficult because the easy petroleum has largely already been pumped, except for places like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. Or you supplement the industry with subsidies from the federal government. So, for those of you who don't drive, those of you who aren't interested in the petroleum industry and don't want to support the use of fossil fuels, if you're paying taxes, you already are, because there are billions of dollars being spent in the United States and globally to prop up the petroleum industry. And that's one of the reasons that prices can be held down, is so that the federal government is actually subsidizing the energy. And it's in their best interests to do so, because if we depend on petroleum as energy, it's part of our national security to make sure that that supply remains not only available, but affordable. And so this is why these subsidies are being invested. And so you can see this is actually through 2021, but the process continues today where oil companies are being subsidized. So are coal countries, so are natural gas, and so on. This is what you can see. And so you can see the price of oil in that line, that dotted line going across the middle. And you can see that it's relatively low. It's had some spikes in 2010 through 2014. You see that drop in 2014. That was the oil glut thanks to the output of oil from Saudi Arabia. 2020, that was the drop from COVID. But you can see that we are more or less staying stable. It's not just global factors, it's also financial factors from things like subsidies that are supporting the industry. Nevertheless, hydrologic fracturing or fracking continues to be used, and increasingly down there at the bottom, you can see that they're now talking more about horizontal drilling in addition to fracking so that they can contact more of the rock formation and produce still more petroleum from these previously exhausted rocks. This is what people talk about currently. This is actually a big deal, using the horizontal drilling in order to maximize the production. But this has a limit. You're still talking about a limited resource, and the more you do this, the more expensive it gets. So there are limits to this. There's also offshore development. They're talking about more of that right now, particularly off the coast of Florida, off the coast of California. The current administration is discussing that right now. You may expect to see a fight going on about that. But once again, the amount of effort involved in offshore work is increasingly expensive, because once you've maximized the near shore offshore fields, you have to move further and further out. The water or the seafloor goes down, it becomes deeper, it becomes more expensive, and there's more cost up front, which then needs to be passed along to the consumer. And the resource remains limited. These resources that people are talking about drilling off the coast are proven reserves. They're known reserves. And so the expense is getting them. This is over and above the probable reserves and the possible reserves we talked about earlier. And obviously, there are also environmental impacts that are a potential repercussion of this sort of development. And so when you look at the energy return on energy investment, and this is a projection through the year 2050, and here we are in the year 2025. And what you can see is pretty much you might have a peak in this production around 2030. And with the caveat that I showed you the peak curves earlier, and it seems like every time they make a projection like this, we keep exceeding that expectation. So that may happen as well. But at least based on this, what you're looking at is a decrease after about 2030, 2035, which is within the next 5 to 10 years. And the only one of these fields that you see increasing over that time is this one, the energy required to produce energy. It's going to take more and more and more energy to produce diminishing amounts of petroleum for energy over the next decade or two, which again, this is going to be your life. This is going to be what you live through. This is what you're going to witness. It is entirely possible that I'm wrong. It is entirely possible that we will find ways around this. It's entirely possible that oil will remain affordable and it won't break the bank. And if that happens, you may hunt me down as an old man. I'll be in a retirement home somewhere. You can come visit me, and I will be sitting there with my little bowl of Jello, and you can laugh at me, and I will share my Jello with you. I will not share my chocolate pudding with you. Get that out of your heads right now. If you visit me and it's chocolate pudding day, it's all mine. You can't have it. But if it's Jello, especially the green Jello, yeah, you can have it. But I don't know. I can't predict the future. All I can do is look at the basic math, both the math in terms of the availability of the resource and the math in terms of the expense of recovering the resource as it becomes increasingly rare. And those numbers don't seem to add up to affordable petroleum. This is something that I have been advised by some of my colleagues not to talk about. Not because it's dangerous, oh my gosh, but simply because they don't want me to convey the wrong message. Because what some people might take away from this lecture is that, well, this is nothing we need to worry about. The problem is going to solve itself in the next few years. That's not the case. We're going to continue to see more and more effort made on producing petroleum. We're going to see more and more effort made on keeping it affordable through more subsidies, through other cost-cutting measures. And you're going to increasingly see oil corporations, oil companies telling you that probably you have nothing to worry about. Yes, that is me being cynical. No, I am not going to test you on that, but that is what we are seeing so far with the past two conferences of the parties as examples of the sort of information that's being passed along and the information that is not being allowed to be passed along in terms of the need to reduce fossil fuels because over and above climate change, it's a non-renewable resource that is present in ever diminishing amounts and that we are consuming at an absolutely staggering rate. But so please don't hear me saying we don't need to worry about climate change because eventually we'll run out of oil and the problem will solve itself. That's not going to happen. More likely, oil will continue to be artificially propped up and prolonged until it becomes so expensive that there's no way around it. And if we haven't by then made a shift to some other energy resource, we're going to be in a world of hurt. And so that's something to keep in mind. Again, if I get it wrong, find me at the rest home, laugh at me. I will eventually get over it. I will need therapy, but I will eventually get over it. But at least based on the numbers I'm looking at, I don't see that being something that happens. And again, this is over and above the greenhouse gas emissions. This is over and above the climate change angle. This is strictly from a resource availability angle. That said, we do have other resources available. We have already talked about coal. There simply isn't enough coal to take the place of petroleum. Just in terms of it doesn't give as much bang for its buck. We talked about that. We're not going to be able to switch over to a coal-powered transportation industry with cars, automobiles, trains, planes, and so on because there's not enough energy. Even if we attempted that, it would be insufficient and we would be consuming the resource in a much quicker pace. In terms of natural gas, we frequently hear about this. Currently, they're estimated as of 2017 almost 7,000 trillion cubic feet of proven gas reserves. But the world has proven reserves equivalent to about 52.3 times its annual consumption. That means about 52 years left of natural gas at current consumption levels. If we make a shift away from petroleum into natural gas, obviously that means we're going to be increasing the consumption of natural gas, increasing the rate of consumption, which means we would have less time available with that resource. So, irrespective of which fossil fuel you're looking at, the fact that we are consuming so much and the fact that all of those resources are finite and non renewable, it means at some point, potentially in your lifetimes, and almost certainly in your children's lifetimes, we are going to see those resources needing to be replaced by something else. And with that, I'm going to end tonight's lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And we'll talk to you next time. Our last meeting before the final exam. So next meeting, I will upload a lecture. I will also upload a study guide for the final exam. Until then, have a good evening. Take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you soon.